One.
Welcome, bonjour, Anin. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Capacity Building Center for Tribes. We're excited to be here. I know it's been a couple of months since we've been able to deliver a webinar, so we're really excited to just spend some time with you. And just for those of you that aren't as familiar with the center, I want to just go over a couple of things and just recognize that the center is federally funded by the Children's Bureau. And, you know, the aim is to assist tribal child welfare programs and help tribes to work at improving practice and performance. I want to take this time and just acknowledge our center leadership. We have Kathy Deserly as well as Nancy Lucero. And then we have our federal program officers at the Children's Bureau, and that is Dr. Roshonda Shoulders and Bob Lindekamp. I don't know if they're on, but if any of them are, I just want to make sure that, you know, we're acknowledging who our leaders are with the Capacity Building Center for Tribes. Again, my name is Jackie Croshoe. My spirit name is Gakadus Aki. I'm a member of the Turtle Mountain Band in North Dakota, and I have had the opportunity to either facilitate or just help with some of our past webinars. So I get excited because it gives me an opportunity to see all of you. I recognize some of the names. I've been able to do some work with some of you in Indian country. So I love this part of my job. I get excited, and especially trying to get you what you need. So hopefully this webinar will deliver a few things. Before I introduce the speakers though, I wanna just talk a little bit about, again, the center. I think some of you might have heard of the Capacity Building Center for States or the Capacity Building Center for Courts. So just so you know, we are a part of that collaborative. And again, you know, we've highlighted some of the services that our center provides, and you can kind of look at them on the screen here. So we have the Tribal Information Exchange that you can just click on and go to. And that is where we have many, many products for you. Videos, we've got our webinar recordings. We also have tools from tribes that they have shared for you all to look at and use. And also some of the other services are the peer groups that we do out there in Indian country with you. We've got some wonderful training academies coming up soon. And again, just ways in which to help you improve practice and performance. So I just want to give you a little teaser as to what the center does and make sure that you know where you can go to get that. So I want to now, just for those of you that haven't already, if you could just tell us who you are in the chat room, maybe just give us your name and the tribe that you work with. I think it's really helpful for us to see who's on there. And then I know a lot of times tribes have connected just through chat rooms. When I was at NICWA, I was able to find some folks at their conference that I hadn't seen for years and just reconnect. So if you could just tell us your name and the tribe that you work with. Appreciate doing that. So now I want to turn it over to our presenters. We have Marnie Evans, Rachel Four, and Cheryl Montoya. And if any of you have worked with them, you get to see how skilled and knowledgeable they are. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
Hey, thank you, Jackie. Thank you so much for the kind words. We appreciate that, for getting us started in such a good way. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name is Marnina Evans, and I am the lead for Data and Technology Services here at the Center for Tribes. I was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona, out in the desert Southwest, but I am talking to you now from Rockville, Maryland, on the traditional lands of the Piscataway people just outside Washington, D.C. And I'm just going to give you, well, first, I will ask my co-presenters to introduce themselves, and then we'll give you just a little bit of a preview of the journey that we're going to take together today discussing data. And I appreciate you all being here. So my co-presenters are Rachel Four and Cheryl Montoya. Rachel, could you introduce yourself for a moment?
Yes, thank you, Marnie. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Four. I'm a Cherokee Nation citizen. I'm joining you from the Cherokee Nation Reservation where I live and work here in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. I am a Title IV specialist for the Capacity Building Center for Tribes, which intersects a lot with data. So that's why I'm here with you today, and I'd invite Cheryl to introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Cheryl Montoya, and I have about a little over 20 years in the child welfare programs, first starting out with the state of New Mexico, and then moving on to the Resource Center for Data and Technology and on to Capacity Building Center for Tribes. I love the work with the Native child welfare programs, and I currently reside in Houston, Texas. So I'm really happy and honored to be with you today.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you to everybody who's introducing themselves in the chat right now. It's wonderful seeing so many folks from so many different places. Just a reminder, make sure that your chat is being directed to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see what you're saying. I think some folks are doing it just to all panelists, which is just us. And while we're very happy to be reading your chats, we want to be able to share with everyone else too. Okay, so our agenda for today, we're going to start out with talking a little bit about the Indigenous history of data and also the data that we use every day in our personal lives, our homes, and our work. And then we're going to start looking at some actual data and how to read it, how to see the story that is within that data. And then we'll talk about how to communicate that story visually, with words, however you want to communicate that to the folks in your community and the people that you want to be able to share your story with. And then we will introduce you to some further resources that we have here at the Capacity Building Center for Tribes. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rachel to get us started.
Well, thank you, Marnie. As we look at the next slide, we want to kind of center what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be talking about data, and we're going to talk about how do you look at data to be able to start to uncover and see stories in the data and understand that those stories are relative in a time continuum. And then move on to talk about, after you start seeing these stories, then how can you visualize the stories of your tribal child welfare programs? And there's so much more to learn about the how-to of visualizing your data, but we want to start at the beginning and talk about data evolving into the stories. So to do that, we're going to lay some groundwork and talk about data in our tribal nations and child welfare programs so that we can talk about how to make the most out of your data. So let's talk on the next slide about how data exists in a continuum that moves all the way towards wisdom. So data becomes information in your context, whatever context that you're working in, whatever tribal agency you're working with, or community organization that you're partnering with in child welfare. And data comes into your programs daily. You have intakes, you have inquiries, you have ICWA notices, case files, judicial determinations, and so many other things that are always coming in as data. And then everyone in your organization, you use that data and information for decision-making, case management, analyzing for trends, and communication of information up and throughout your entire organization. So as you see on the screen, this data starts the continuum and it continues to flow, and eventually data turns into information, which turns into your knowledge, which turns into wisdom eventually. And data is just the beginning of that continuum, and it leads us to the information and the movement through the continuum. If you look at data, you know that it's always coming in, and we utilize it every single day to gain us some information. And I think on the next slide, Laura, if you'll go to it, we talk about how as Indigenous people, we have always gathered data. We've always shared information. We have historical records that show that we were collecting data to create information from time immemorial. Visual data and storytelling have been part of our everyday lives. We share our culture and our ways of being and our learning in all of these ways. And this visual learning and sharing of data and information, this is inherent to our sovereignty in our nations. And so as we talk about how data becomes wisdom in that continuum, and that we have indigenous knowledge through our use of data, we're going to watch next one of our colleagues at the Capacity Building Center for Tribes, John Gozen Center, and he's going to discuss this a little deeper in a video we want to share.
To me, when I look at my culture, historically, it was this wisdom continuum they initiated. We did have a government and a social system that operated on information. So this making good decisions based on experiential knowledge evolves into wisdom. So that thing still applies, that continuum still applies today, of making good decisions. So the technology in its form for what it is, especially for understanding our people, our most valuable asset, is using tools such as this. It's nothing magical. It's the impetus of asking the right question and information that lies underneath that can provide you that answer. So you got to have a lot of base data, a lot of base information, and that's where everything starts from, is having some base data that leads to an inquiry to what other information do we need that we can interlace and compile to make a good answer. To me, when I look at my culture, historically, it was this wisdom continuum they initiated. We did have a government and a social system that operated on information. So this making good decisions based on experiential knowledge evolves into wisdom. So that thing still applies, that continuum still applies today, of making good decisions. So the technology in its form for what it is, especially for understanding our people, our most valuable asset, is using tools such as this. It's nothing magical. It's the impetus of asking the right question and information that lies underneath that can provide you that answer. So you got to have a lot of base data, a lot of base information, and that's where everything starts from, is having some base data that leads to an inquiry to what other information do we need that we can interlace and compile to make a good answer.
So as John shared with us how data is indigenous to Native people and since their beginnings, I want us to look a moment at just personal data. We all collect data at home, and we balance our checkbooks. We keep track of steps we accomplish during the day. If you have a step thing on your smartwatch or on your phone, we take our blood pressure, we keep track of medications and make grocery lists and look at our children's report cards. And this is the base data that John was talking about in that video. But then we can even run quality assurance on some of these activities. For example, if your child's report card has some low grades on it, you may make some adjustments to help change those grades, like getting their child tutoring or making sure they study each night, or et cetera. Or if you didn't get enough steps in, you change that the next day and get more steps in. So using that base data as your information to give you knowledge and further wisdom. So we've looked at some personal data we gather. And while we collect data at work on the children and families we serve, let's look at the next slide so we can look at some of that data. So when you collect data, you want it to tell you something. Here we see you may be collecting like the number of children that you have in state and tribal custody, your number of ICWA cases. You could compare your number of staff to how many children you have in custody to see what kind of caseloads they're carrying. You could look at the number of services you offered and what kinds of services you offered. But what does this data do for you? So it can tell you a story to your grant funders. You can relate a story to tribal council. You can relate stories back to your workers, and used that information for 4B and 4E information. So data weaves in and out of your office and gives information just as Rachel talked about, so that it can become knowledge and then on to wisdom. So let's follow on the next slide a piece of data by looking at a video and see how many people and places that it could touch.
A day in the life of data. Every child welfare worker's day begins with data. Whether it is which visitation they are doing today, which court report is due, or what staffing is going to happen, their case files abound. The worker and their data are part of your child welfare program, and the program ultimately houses all of the data. And your programs have an immense amount of data. Each program houses their data in a specific way, whether that's paper, individual case files, or a case management data system. So let's see how data travels throughout your program. Staff enter many elements of data into your system, things like birth date, placements, court hearings, school information, and a host of other things. Your staff uses this information to inform them in decision-making around cases and case progress, and this data is often shared with tribal and state court systems and other partners who assist in your work. Data flows back and forth throughout the program during the life of the case, and it is constantly building. Caseworkers use the information to manage their cases and also to communicate with their supervisors and leadership. Data also flows back and forth between the program and your tribal and state court systems. The courts need data to manage the legal flow of the cases, and their data in return becomes part of the case file and must be communicated. All of the use of data impacts the family who's receiving services, and interactions between the families and staff become part of the case file. Caseworkers are always working to capture all of this data about their interactions in their cases, which ultimately begins the cycle of data all over again.
I had a lag on my end. I'm sorry if you did, but it showed it as a cycle of that data weaving in and out of the office and through the courts, and how it affects the people at home. So now Rachel is going to ask us some questions in the next few slides so that we can get a pulse of where you and your program stand around data.
Thank you, Cheryl. So Laura's going to help us launch a Zoom poll. And what we want to ask in this Zoom poll is, how do you and your work, how do you currently capture data? There are multiple choices that you can do there: electronic database, paper files, Excel spreadsheets, an option for no system, or an access database. So if we could have all of our participants take part in telling us, how do you currently capture data in the program you're working in? We'll give this about a minute or a minute and 15 seconds for everyone to engage in the poll. And Laura, I can't see from my end, but are you receiving responses?
Yes, about 70% of folks online have voted
Okay,
so far.
good.
So we'll give it about 10 more seconds.
Okay, good. I'll let you decide when to close it out. Perfect. So it's showing that the biggest majority of the respondents are housing it either in an electronic database or Excel spreadsheets. So that's helpful for us to understand as we go through the presentation today. So let's move on to our next question, which we're actually going to engage with you in the chat. And the next question is, what could data do for your program? So if you're thinking about, you know that you capture data all day long and it comes out in various reports and you use it in various ways, but if you really just sit and think, what do I want to know from my data and what can the data tell me? Share with us in the chat, if you would, what could data do for your program? So just some things to get you thinking. Could it inform you on additional services you might need to provide? Could it inform you on better ways to capture data so that you can use it in ways that you want? And we'll share some of the chat as it comes along. So we have one person sharing that they could help them determine what services are needed for the family so that we can say what's going on in our cases right now. It could inform your practice and know how many ICWA workers you need. And then somebody mentioned culturally responsive services. We see things like identify gaps in services or trends that can identify your emerging issues. This is one of my favorites. What services are successful, and then what are the areas we can improve on, right? We want to know what's going well, not just what needs to be fixed. And using it to visually tell a story that shows what the trends and gaps are, and help determine if additional staff is needed to support the work. So I encourage you all to continue to engage in the chat so that you can say what can data do for your program. And as other people are posting things that make you think of something else, please, we encourage you to share in this space. So let's go to our next Zoom poll. And let's see, in what ways are you currently using data? So we're using it for reporting purposes, informed decision-making, reporting to either your tribal council or tribal administration, or to inform your staff. We'll give this just about a minute for everyone to respond. All right, let's close it down. There you go. So it looks like the biggest portion is you're using it for reporting, with another big chunk of you using it for informed decision making. But then there's also a healthy mix of that reporting to tribal council and/or tribal admin and informing your staff, which we find to be pretty consistent with what we hear in our technical assistance work across the center. So now let's go talk about, let's look on the next slide, Laura. And let's talk about what happens when you're reading your data. So as someone starts to look at data, there's things that you want to start reading in there. And you guys have shared a lot of this in the chat, but we want to look for trends in the data. What are things that are arriving that you see are happening that need to be addressed? Is that we have too many children in non-relative homes, and we need to focus on relative home recruitment. We need to find more families. What are those trends tell us that needs to be done in our agency? And then what are the implications in the practice within your tribal programs once you see these trends? How do you move from the trends to say, this is what we need to move into practice so that we're serving our children and families in the very best way? And within that, then, when you start to see the trends and the stories and you understand what you're putting into practice, then what are the messages within this data that we need to communicate? Whether you need to communicate those in-house to the workforce within your tribal program, within your entire tribal nation, to understand what are the supports that this child welfare program needs from the tribal nation, and even out into the community as to what are ways that the community can help support the workforce and the families that are intersecting with our child welfare programs. So let's look at the next slide, Laura, and we want to talk about how stories start to emerge within the data. So one of the first ways that people typically see stories within data is an anecdotal. And that's like, an individual voice or story or opinion that shows up. And you're seeing that this might be something that is of importance, but you don't have any kind of long-term time data that tells you whether this is meaningful or whether it's a long-term implication. And so a story I would share is the anecdotal things are like when you're talking in your child welfare programs about different cases and things that happen. And in one case, this is working really well with a family. In another case, this is things that are working really well. Those tend to be like anecdotal data that show up. When we capture data and analyze the data, we can see whether that anecdotal data might move into the point in time portion. And this is a snapshot of that data at a particular point in time. So that might be, this is the data for relative and non-relative homes over the last 6 months. And it would tell us how many of our children are in out-of-home placement in relative homes and how many are in non-relative homes. And that point in time data gives us a much clearer snapshot of what's going on within the agency. And then there's longitudinal ways that data shows up in our stories, and that is trends over time. So if you look at year over year, as opposed to a 6-month time period, you can see at this time last year, we had this many children in relative and non-relative homes. And then a year later, we have this many in relative and non-relative homes. And that's kind of how the data stories start to come off in that anecdotal, and then you can switch into a point in time and then a longitudinal look to see, are these things really happening as trends, or are they little peaks in the data that we might not have seen? So we want to look at this a little bit, and how do you use that in decision making and looking at the case level data? So I'm now going to turn it over to Cheryl and have her look at some specific data sets.
Thank you, Rachel. If we look at the next slide, what we put together was just a short made-up case scenario. And for the sake of time, I'm going to read it to you aloud. This isn't a perfect or complete case scenario, but as you listen and read yourself, we would like to see if you could pick out some important pieces of data. And we want to hear about that. And, you know, if you could put it in the chat. Also, we want you to look for missing data. What wasn't said? What wasn't asked? What information is missing in these? Are there questions you would have asked to add to Stuart's story? So as you think of things, if you could, please type them in the chat, and Marnie will be monitoring those responses, and we'll come back around to that in just a moment. So I want to read it to you just really quick. It says, Stuart, who's 7 years old, American Indian and Hispanic, resides with his mother, Leticia Sanchez, within the tribal service area. Stuart's father, David Sanchez, has not been in the picture since he was 2. So at age 4, Stuart is diagnosed with diabetes. And at the age of 7, he's diagnosed with nearsightedness. At 7 p.m. on February 18th, Leticia is arrested for driving under the influence and admits that she had a few drinks after work and she took some opioids. When Leticia tells police that Stuart is in the care of a neighbor for the evening, the police call to ask if the neighbor can keep him through the weekend until Leticia can be arraigned on Monday. When the neighbor indicates that she cannot because she has to go to work the next morning, Stuart's then placed by the agency in the home of Carlita Gallant at 11 p.m. on that same day, February 18th. So as Rachel discussed in the previous slide when she was talking about kinds of data, someone could read this scenario and think, wow, the tribe is starting to have issues with opioids. One might think we have to put some services in for opioid abuse. But this piece of data could possibly be anecdotal. And we'll look on the next slide whenever we look at a spreadsheet and see if it might be anecdotal. So are we having any responses? If you could just go back one slide, Laura, and we'll get there in just a moment.
Yes, we have one note so far, identifying a few missing pieces of data, one of which is what is the tribal service area? They're always important to know geographically what's going on. What's the name of the neighbor and what's their relationship to the family? That's important too. Are they kin? Are they close friends? Are they just the neighbor? And then we have another question, were the parents married at the time of birth? That's also information not there. Any other thoughts from folks about what information is important here or what important information we don't have that would be really good to have? Did they ask about relatives? So we don't even know if they inquired or found any. How bad or severe is the diabetes? Is the child on medication, etc.? Are there siblings? And is Stuart enrolled? And if so, in what tribe? Yep, another question about medication. Does the child need his medication? That's an important thing to know when finding a placement. And then we need more info generally about the placement and about his school. Where is he going to school? Of course, we want to keep him in his school if at all possible. Those are all really good thoughts.
And Marnie, I think it's something that we wanted to mention here too was, you know, there's a lot of information that comes in when we have these children who are placed in out-of-home care. And this is what you typically would see on some sort of intake or report form about that. And so all of these are really good questions, and they really lead us to say, I think the quote I heard the last time was, what is the pieces of information that lead us towards truths? And that really resonated with me when I heard it, because there's so much information. The complexities of working with these families are so large. And so we're giving you a snapshot and asking you to help us expand that snapshot so that we can all see what are all the other pieces of data and stories that we want to be able to gain by the use of data and information.
That's right. What's going to really tell us the true story of this family?
Well, thank you everybody for your responses in the chat. And if you think of something, even though we progress to another slide, please put it in the chat anyway. And I promise we're not going to leave you hanging. We are going to loop back around and talk about those missing pieces. So when working in child welfare, whether a worker or a supervisor, we often see reports with columns of data. And I want to show you that in the next slide. Even on the spreadsheets, we can start to see a story. So let's look at a spreadsheet on the next slide, if we could. So as you kind of peruse through this, at first glance, the data looks pretty dismal. But I challenge you to look at some positives that you can see in this spreadsheet. If you see something, please type it in the chat. But upon first look, you see we have 10 children listed here with their reasons for removal. If they were removed because of drug abuse, it has what kind of drug. It has their days in care, their number of placements, the kinds of foster homes, distance from foster home to the office, and whether it's a sibling split or not. So on the last slide, remember I mentioned about the opioid abuse that could be a problem in the service area. However, when you look at this spreadsheet, it tells you a little bit different story, that it doesn't look like, at least for this point in time report, it doesn't look like there's a problem with opioids, but rather meth. And also at first glance, without looking at longitudinal data, some services around meth abuse or addiction might be indicated. Additionally, when you look at the kinds of foster homes, it does look as if all but maybe 2 children are now in relative placement. So this is a positive thing, correct? This tells us that the Tribal Child Welfare Program did a good job of searching out for relatives that the children could stay with and have some permanency. So let's spend a little bit of time with Rachel talking about missing information that could be included in Stuart's story. So if we could go on to the next slide.
Thank you, Cheryl. So You know, we kind of alluded to this earlier, but now we want to ask you guys to engage with us in the chat to say, you know, you've talked about some things that we're missing, but I want to kind of focus some of our efforts on what are some strength-based language and data elements that are missing from this story that we could catalog, and what are there cultural protective factors that we're not picking up on? And there's many examples here on the screen. So tell us in the chat what other things you think that we could be picking up from Stuart's story to, like we said, lead us to the truths of this case. So we have one person shared, you know, child was left with a trusted person. I think that that is definitely some strength-based data elements that we would want to know about and that we would want to capture. And the sharing that your mother has made arrangements for Stuart, right? She didn't leave him by himself. She left him with a trusted person who, from what we can infer, was someone he was used to. And what are the other things that we could be asking about or trying to capture in data that would be things that we have missing right here in our data story? Give just another little bit for people to share in the chat. So prudent parenting is a factor that can and should be considered as well. I agree. She didn't drive with Stuart in the car, and she was honest about her use of alcohol and drugs. Those are two really big things that lead us really closer to the truths of what's going on within this family. And we have another sharing in the chat is that it would be nice to find out the health of Stuart over time. We know he has a diabetes diagnosis and he is on medication, but it would be nice to know about that long-term health. And then what is the father's involvement? Additionally, I would say, where's the paternal grandparents, and what do they provide any supports to the family, and are they familial connections? And as you guys are continue to share in the chat, there's some questions that I think as you start to look at data, you know, I just want to mention as we're thinking about this. But when we talk about what's missing from the story and all of these, the strengths-based language and the data elements, so what are the supports to the family, and who are we asking about that? Where are we gathering that information? And then how are we structuring our case management to how do we capture that so that it can be reported out on so that we know this information? We had another chat participant share that they're curious how impaired she was and how it was determined that he was in immediate danger, that he needed to be placed in a non-relative foster care. That's a great question that we need to be asking. As we look at these elements, we also want to say, how are caseworkers, how are they assessing to find out this data and information, and where are they capturing this so that we can have some of the cultural protective factors and the strengths-based language and data elements. And then how are we as people who work in this area, how are we going to have this larger conversation about putting strength-based language and cultural protective factors into the data that we capture? And how does that deepen our daily practice? So I would invite everyone and anyone who's sharing in the chat to also share thoughts as I've asked some of those questions about how do we implement strengths-based language into our data elements and cultural protective factors into our data elements to show the missing parts of the story that aren't typically represented in our data systems or our Excel spreadsheets. And feel free to continue to engage in the chat around that. So we also want to invite you to reach out to us at the Capacity Building Center for Tribes if there are further conversations that you want to have on that strength-based language. And I think Marnie or Cheryl are going to talk about that a little bit later. But let's go to the next slide and let's talk about visualizing a change over time. So you saw the data set, the Excel sheet from earlier, and Cheryl talked about this, the relative and non-relative home. So This is a way of visualizing where the program was in January of 2021 with more non-relative homes and kids placed there than non-relatives. But when you look at January of 2022, that has decreased greatly and we have many more in the relative home. And this is data that you want to showcase and you want to tell people about, because this is a great representation of good practice being put in place for children to be with their relatives. And so we want to be able to showcase this type of visualization of data. So let's go to the next slide and look at how would you tell your stories through the visualization of data. So we've showed you one that just represents a graphical chart of your data, but there's also ways to showcase your data like the Oregon Center for Families does for their foster parents. These are all foster care facts that they wanted to share. And they gathered all of their data to create this visualization to showcase to the community what their needs are and what's happening with foster care in their programs. And, you know, when you think about visualization of data, there's many examples you can find out there, much like this one and the one we just showed you. There's a couple of questions that you really want to ask yourself. What do you want to tell your community, your state, your tribal nation about your child welfare program? What do you want to share? And I would invite anyone at this point, please tell us in the chat if there are things that come to your mind as you hear that, of what do you want to tell your community, your tribal nation, your county, or even your state about your child welfare program. So do you want to tell them about the needs for foster homes? Did you want to tell them about the kinds of services you offered? Do you want to engage in this visualization of data to change the narrative that child welfare programs are bad for the community, or they're just going to come and take your kids, to all the services that you provide to keep families together and to reunify and support families when they're in crisis? So when we talk about how would you tell your stories, one of the first things, I just saw this in the chat that somebody shared, but you know, they want to tell people we care deeply about the parents. And that really resonates with me as I read that on my screen, because so many workers that are working in our tribal child welfare programs, they just want to see kids with parents and parents doing well and families whole. So that is a great thing to share. I appreciate the sharing of that. When you look at how would you tell your stories, there's a couple of things that you want to entertain. What are your audiences? Who is out there that is listening to you? And where do you have opportunity to have people listening to you? So where do you have opportunities within your own tribal program to explain services that maybe everyone doesn't understand? Your tribal council, your governor or chief or president or tribal administrator, whatever you have in your tribal nation, and your communities that you serve. And you can use that data to convey what your tribal programs provide, what support you need, and other ways that you can engage with them. And then how do you want to go about data visualization? Do you want to show how well your services are doing? Do you want to show foster care facts like this so people understand about foster care in your program? Or do you want somebody to understand the need for foster homes in your community? There's many things to think about as you do that. And then there's the last thing is the impact of visualizing data. And when you utilize data to visualize the information that you have, this is the part that my colleagues hear me say all the time, that ties the head and the heart together. And when you can tie the head and the heart together, this is the part that makes people want to enact change. They want to take action. They want to get out there and help and do what they can. And so the use of data visualization can be very impactful to your audiences, and a lot of time takes the difference between knowing and realizing. You might know that foster care is an issue and that there's not enough homes, but hearing and seeing the stories of children who aren't able to be placed close to their home or having to travel many miles just to get to their school, those are the things that turn it into realizing. So I'm going to share a story with you that was shared with me from a previous colleague at Cherokee Nation Indian Child Welfare, and her name is Hetty Charbonneau. And Hetty is allowing me to share the story with you. But she told me the story of how her recruitment staff used data to inform tribal council on the need for foster homes. So what her staff did was they got these big glass mason jars, and they made them really pretty, and they painted the lid, and they tied raffia around the top. And they put 2 sizes of gumballs in each jar. There were small gumballs in the bottom that represented the number of Cherokee children in that tribal council member's district that were in foster care. And they had large gumballs at the top that represented the number of foster homes in that tribal council person's district. So some council members had no large gumballs representing no foster homes in their district. They did still have small gumballs that represented all the kids in care that couldn't be placed near their home. Some of them had, large and small gumballs. But what they found after they did this data visualization activity with the tribal council was that they found that it tied the head and the heart together for them, and they immediately wanted to take action. What do you need from me so that we can get foster homes in my district? What do I need to do? Please tell me how to communicate with people. And that brought people together, the head and the heart tied together, and said, let's take action, let's do what we need to do. And always remember that data visualization can be that impactful for each of you in your own organizations. So I feel like I've been talking for a long time, but I feel like that's such wonderful information to share with everybody. So I'm going to give this back to Marnie now, I think, and either Marnie or Cheryl, and they're going to talk a little bit about how can you build data capacity for your child welfare programs.
Thanks, Rachel. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So as we saw from our polling results and from a lot of the conversation, all of you are very active in building your data capacity, and that's why you're here. And everybody's at a different place in our journey through data. So wherever you are, the Capacity Building Center for Tribes is here for you to offer whatever we can for wherever you are in that process. So Jackie mentioned this at the beginning of our time together, but I just want to reiterate that we have a few different types of services that we can offer. One, if you're from a tribal child welfare program that receives either Title IV-B or Title IV-E funding, then you are eligible for direct technical assistance. And we can do on-site projects with you that could be extensive or just short consultations for whatever topics that you need help with. We also offer a number of opportunities for peer engagement, either through larger work groups or small one-on-one engagements with other tribes who are working on similar issues or who have some experience that might be helpful to you. And of course, at the Tribal Information Exchange, which Laura, I think, just put into the chat, the address for, we have some wonderful tools and resources. You could find a lot of webinars just like this one with a number of different topics. And of course, our wide array of data-related tools and resources. And I want to make a special mention of the Tools for Tribes from Tribes section, which I think is one of our best features and has a whole bunch of tools and resources and examples of tools and policy and all sorts of things that are directly from other child welfare programs, which they have generously allowed us to share on the website. And of course, if you have some things that you would like to share, we're always open to having some additions to that section. And I want to ask Cheryl just to give us a little bit of a walkthrough on what a data capacity building project could look like if anyone was interested in that. So Cheryl?
Sure, thanks, Marnie. Well, since I can give it to you from my own experience, I'm a data systems specialist. So whenever a tribal child welfare program is looking for possibly a data system, we spend a lot of time together. It's really just partnering together to sit down, whether it be in person or through a different platform like Zoom, and start to go through what their business processes look like. So we spend a lot of time together just getting ideas. So whenever you're giving your business processes, this is how we do investigations, or this is what we do when we go out and we're looking for different placements. Listen to that and take lots of notes and see what you would have or need in a data system. So I write copious notes and share that back with the program. We can do a vendor scan where we look at demos. I set up the demos and just kind of facilitate on those, and you can look at different vendors, possible vendors that might meet your needs, all the way through implementation of whatever data system that you decide to select. So when we say building data capacity, we are not doing it. It's not like we come in with a package and hand it over and say, see ya. We really go hand in hand with you along on that, either the consultation or the project. So we'd love to have you put in an inquiry and see if you want to move forward.
Thanks, Cheryl. We have one question in the Q&A section on what data management platform system are folks using. And so as Cheryl just mentioned, that is something we can help with. We don't recommend anything in particular, but we can help you figure out what's out there, what might be, have the specifications that are most suited to your program, and also connect you with other tribal programs that may be using the same software brand, and so that you can learn from their experiences and kind of hear about how that went for them. Okay, we're ready for the next slide.
Marnie, before you go on to the next slide, are you asking the group to put what data management platform system they use in the chat room? Is that the question to our tribal audience?
I think if anybody would like to share that, please feel free. I don't think we're going to go into an in-depth discussion of different systems right now because we don't have the time for that, but absolutely feel free to share if anybody would like to connect on that. Okay, and right, so as we have in the chat, please do visit the Tribal Information Exchange for all the resources that we've been mentioning. And I'll mention too that we are always developing new resources and new tools. So if you go and say you're looking at the data tools and you say, you know what, I'm just not seeing something that I really would like to have, feel free to drop us a line and let us know that you're interested in a particular topic or a particular type of tool, and we will do our best to make that happen at some point. We really like to have that information. Okay. Ready for the next slide? Okay, this is our final slide with our contact information. So if you have any follow-up questions or you'd like to place an inquiry with us or are looking for any type of information that we could help with, feel free to give us a call or an email at any time. And I just want to open it up to folks for our last opportunity to ask questions or raise some discussion topics in the chat, or remember that you can always raise your hand and Laura will unmute you as well. Oh, thank you, Laura, for linking some of our data resources in the chat. Questions to ask a system vendor, that's one of my favorites. A lot of really helpful information for how to have those initial conversations with a software company about their system and how it might be able to answer your needs as a program.
And Marnie, one thing I was going to just, kind of bring back up for everyone is as they participate in the after webinar evaluation, we want to be responsive to what the needs are out there in their tribal programs. So telling us what future conversations they would like to see in webinars, what future information they would like presented in the webinars would be really helpful and useful for us to be responsive to what the needs are out there.
Thanks, that's a great reminder, Rachel.
Yeah, and Laura just posted that evaluation in the chat. If you can click and take it for us as well.
Also wanted to mention, to go along with what Rachel said, if the webinar platform is a little bit harder because number one, we can't see you and we can't hear you. So if you're interested in a possible peer group of some sort, where it's more of like a roundtable setup and sharing, please put that in your evaluation. That would be really helpful.
Yes, and again, if there are particular topics or particular focus areas that you'd be interested in, we'd like to hear that as well, because that really helps us with our planning. Someone asked, are the tribes in the business of data management systems or platforms? There are some that are native owned. We definitely know a few of those. Says, yes, this is wonderful. I've never viewed data as a way to tell stories. Well, thank you for that comment. We really appreciate that. I think that's one of the primary purposes of data, really, is to be able to understand our own stories and to be able to tell them to others.
So maybe I see, John, you're asking a question about names of tribal owned software. So I'm wondering, for those of you out there on the call, tribes that may have case management systems that have been designed by tribes, could you let John Michael know what particular software or case management system you are using to help kind of answer his question? It's hard for us because I don't know that we have knowledge of many, but I'd hate to even come across as promoting one over the other, because we are not, we won't do that. If any of you have some systems you want to, case management systems that have been developed by tribes, if you could put the name of the system, the developers in the.
Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, we don't want to seem like we're recommending one over the other, as you said. And of course, our knowledge is not always comprehensive either. There may be more out there that we'd like to know about too. And we find that out from all of you.
And we'd hate to miss one. That's part of the problem, John Michael, is we'd hate to indicate 2, but there are really 5. And then the 3 who didn't get mentioned would be not happy. So that's part of it. Or John Michael, you could reach out to us individually and we could share with you kind of what we have been familiar with as far as what tribes have used and have shared with us.
Mm-hmm. And as Cheryl was saying, a lot of this is about what is right for your program, which may not be right for a different program. So, just buying something off the shelf is not always the answer. You really want to take time to consider the individual programs and what they can offer.
Now, just to give you some examples of that, some tribal programs may want to use just a person-centric data system, meaning that all the information you're putting in per person. Others want to use like a family-based system where everybody in the family is in one case. Some of the person-centric data systems have the ability to link relatives together and become in one case. Just different things like that. Like if you don't do investigations, the state does investigations, but you take it over after that, your system may look different than one that does do investigations. Are you a 4E development grantee, or are you not interested in 4E at all? Your question about is SACWIS in use within any of the tribes? We call it actually TACWIS because it's tribal. And yes, they are working with the Division of Tribal Systems to meet that. So thank you for that question. We had a question, Laura, about if they can do the survey through email. Is that possible?
Yes, absolutely. I'll be sending the survey and all the links that I put in the chat today via email right after the webinar concludes. And the recording from this session will be available next week. I'll also share a link to our YouTube channel where that will also be posted, as well as the Tribal Information Exchange. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.